If you spend any time in the online discourse surrounding Paradox games, ranging from the forums to Reddit to even this video, you'll find a lot of people that really passionately complain about Paradox Interactive. I genuinely believe I can make a 20-minute video just listing unique complaints about Paradox I found, but that is not what I'm going to do today. No, it is not unusual in longer conversations or posts about Paradox for someone to point out that Paradox has a monopoly on grand strategy, and the desire for some new good company to show up and do grand strategy games good, so that Paradox can be defeated or at least dethroned, certainly does exist. And yet, when it comes to competition, there seems to be nothing. Why is that? Well, let's start this video with an immediate disclaimer. Paradox does, within grand strategy games, have competition. However, much like Steam technically has competition from Epic Games as a digital storefront for video games, well, Paradox does have competition in grand strategy game space, primarily from Civilization and from Creative Assembly, aka the makers of Total War. The irony, though, is that for many people complaining about Paradox Interactive not having competition, Civ and Total War aren't considered competition, but they still are. They are just that much worse compared to Paradox Interactive in the space of complex grand strategy simulation. To be more clear about this, let us define what grand strategy is versus just strategy. Strategy is implicitly much smaller in scope, and is about achieving a local victory or goal. So for example, World of Tanks, you are making strategic decisions when you decide upon tactics like going for encirclements and flanking the enemy, or trying to hold a position. The same can be said for a city builder. There is strategy in how you lay out your city to minimize car pollution, or maximize tax revenue, or whatever. Those are all tactical small-scope decisions. Grand strategy, meanwhile, is the more zoomed-out, closely related cousin, but it is more concerned with the bigger picture. The grand strategy decision is one of how many tanks do I send to this battle, or even am I taking this battle in the first place, instead of specific movements for the World of Tanks example given earlier. Or even in the case of a city builder, you're less concerned where the industrial zone goes and more concerned with where we're placing the cities themselves as a whole, or even if we're building a city or we're going to use those resources instead to maybe invest in some new units. There are more distinctions to make for sure, and it is a debate that can have a video all of its own as well, but that is a definition I'm going to be using today. I'm also going to be applying the definition in good faith, which is to say you can technically change your scope around quite a lot to reapply the definitions. So for example in Polytopia you can make decisions about training more units and fighting in specific bits of the map or focusing on your technology and so on and spending a lot of your resources spamming units, or doing something else or developing your economy, which is to say you can technically define Polytopia as a grand strategy title. This is technically, again, true within certain interpretations, but Polytopia in good faith I do not believe can be defined as a grand strategy game. That doesn't make Polytopia bad, to be clear. I do really enjoy the game personally, but with that said, Civilization and Total War definitely are grand strategy games. For Civilization, yes, there are a lot of strategic decisions like specific buildings to build and specific unit placements. However, a campaign of Civilization involves grand strategy decisions like what victory to focus on. Everything from deciding if I'm building an extra unit, or I'm building a settler, or I'm building a district instead, to what enemy civilizations do I fight, or which ones do I befriend, or even what eventual victory conditions to go for. All of these are examples of grand strategy decisions. The same is true for Total War games. The main gameplay, as it were, is still the campaigns of those games. Whether we're talking about Warhammer Total War or Medieval 2 or Shogun 2. Yes, the battles are a big part, hell even a key part, but they are nevertheless a key part within the context of the campaign map, and the grand strategy decisions of that campaign. Yes, of course there are tactics in both games, and a lot of the time there are also tactics within Paradox games too, but being able to outmaneuver the enemy stack in EU5 or win a siege race in CK3 or outmicro another player in multiplayer Hoi4, that doesn't make those games less grand strategy. But nevertheless, why are these Total War games and Civ games that are certainly not unpopular not really seen as competition for Paradox Interactive? Well, let's start with Civilization. If there is a founding father for the genre, it's Civilization, but Civilization is so huge, it has for all intents and purposes defined a genre of video games almost itself as a subclass of grand strategy, the 4X game. This ironically is part of the problem. What a Civilization game actually is, its gameplay loop and assumptions are really nonsensical when you zoom out, but aren't just part of Civilization, they are fundamentally a core aspect of the Civilization franchise. I'll touch upon Civilization 7 in more detail soon enough, but a country being France, or America, or Zulu, from 4000 BC to the modern era makes absolutely no sense. However, when Civilization 7 changed this change alone honestly became a contender for the single least popular decision in the entire franchise. Now, is it true for me to point out that York, the city, was not founded by the country of England in 2500 BC when Queen Elizabeth decided to build a settler from London? Yes. It is also not a criticism, because Civilization is at best a game inspired by human history, meaning that something like the Inca using the great prophet Confucian to found Shintoism in the holy city of Cusco is entirely believable, but we draw the line at building a road on a mountain. Unless we're playing Civ 3 and earlier, in which case you can build a road on a mountain. Oh, and I guess in Civ 6 you are allowed to tunnel a mountain, but absolutely no roads. No, 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 that's where you draw the line. All of this is to say, civilization can be seen as an alternative and hence a form of competition from a game sales point of view. In fact, it's not even unfair to say that compared to the general population, someone being interested in a Paradox game is quite likely to be interested in civilization and vice versa. But from the perspective of their most vocal enjoyers, those people that are most likely to engage with and interact with the discussion online, they are considered way too far apart and hence not real competition. Now, can Firaxis do more of a pivot towards competing with Paradox, create a separate game series even to Civilization but still under their umbrella that plays on the world map with historical nation setup and, well, basically make an EU4 extended timeline mod but from the ground up? On paper, absolutely. But Firaxis has recently released Civilization 7, a game I personally actually quite liked, although as always I had a lot of things to criticize, and believe me, well, there's money to be made hating Civilization 7 on the internet. But I feel like I have to be honest and say very controversial things like I personally don't mind civ switching, and I think a lot of the smaller changes that they made, like navigable rivers and tech masteries, are good. I like those. Which doesn't absolve Civilization 7 of its very real issues, but the truth of the matter is, my opinion here doesn't matter. A lot of people really didn't like Civilization 7, which is terrible news for people that want competition for Paradox Interactive. Not only have at least some people gone from Civilization to Paradox Interactive as a consequence, even if it is something as indirect as spending an evening playing Hoi4 instead of Civ, but Firaxis as a company is now more focused on fixing Civ than trying to make a new game to more directly compete with Paradox Interactive. All of this is to say, Firaxis is out of the picture, certainly for the foreseeable at least. And now let's talk about Creative Assembly. Oh boy, what a conversation we're about to have. Well, so that this video isn't me listing their incompetence and sheer malice for hours on end, I'm just going to give a couple examples. Like their relatively most recent debacle where they had a bug where certain AI factions just didn't play their game, as in didn't recruit units, didn't move armies, did nothing. The AI was basically just turned off. Imagine if you played Hearts of Iron 4, a World War II game, if you're out of the loop, and the British and Italian AIs just didn't build units. They didn't declare wars, they didn't build any buildings, they just straight up turned themselves off. Now imagine not only Paradox shipping a beta with that, got feedback from internal testers and the public that, oh, by the way, the AI is broken. They then would push that beta into the live game, and after people pointed out again that, oh, by the way, it's broken, Paradox would proceed to ignore it and move on and start working and then selling the next DLC. Say all you want about Paradox Interactive, but at least they fixed their games eventually. Creative Assembly would turn around and, you guessed it, ignore the issue and ship the next DLC. Look, Leviathan sucked. I made a whole video about it. Here's a link to that video. But at least they reacted to that train wreck by delaying the new DLC and fixing everything, even if that fix would take them straight up a year. And since we are talking DLC, there are absolutely reasons to criticize the Paradox DLC model. But it's also remarkable that we can look at the Paradox DLC model and go, well, you know what? At least it's not Creative Assembly, because that company has innovations like you need DLC from Warhammer 1 and Warhammer 2 to get stuff in the newest game Warhammer 3. And sure, you can argue that it's smaller stuff and the game is playable anyway, and the biggest fans already have the DLC, but can you imagine if Paradox Interactive said, here is EU5, oh, but we are locking like 20 random nations and formals behind EU4 and EU3 DLC, so make sure you have all of them. Now, here I'm going to quote a YouTube comment of all things, and I couldn't find the comment again, sorry for this video, so just have to trust me, I stole it off the internet. I saw a conversation complaining about the Paradox DLC policy, I mean, nothing unusual, I guess, followed by a comment saying that, well, at least it's not Creative Assembly's DLC policy, followed by a statement that I just had to include in this video because I found it so on the nose, which stated that saying that you have a better DLC policy than Creative Assembly is a bit like saying your country has a better human rights record than the Soviet Union. And I do apologize for doing a politics by bringing up the Soviet Union human rights track record of all things, but I nevertheless do believe this is a pretty good summary of the situation. And the biggest irony of all of this, Creative Assembly has to their best ability trying to compete and is trying to compete with Paradox Interactive. The problem? It's Creative Assembly. When they made Total War 3 Kingdoms, a game that was actually enjoyed and had a pretty healthy launch all things considered, they had to do a Creative Assembly by launching an unpopular DLC. This would have been fine, hell, Paradox Interactive launches bad DLC all the time, but they then publicly complained that the DLC wasn't selling very well, because the DLC for a new start date that no one cared about or wanted to play was not selling very well. Now, Creative Assembly, being a reasonable company, decided to respond to this by putting the DLC on sale and moving on to work on the next one. I'm just kidding. They said, if you're not going to buy the DLC, we will stop developing the game. And then when people naturally didn't buy the DLC, because who wants to buy a DLC for a game where the developer said there's a good chance we're going to stop developing the game, and remember, the DLC is still bad, they then turned around and stopped development. Great job, you did it. You killed your own game to win an argument? Imagine if Paradox Interactive did that. Imagine if during the development of Crusader Kings 2, when they released the Aztec Invasion, a DLC that no one really wanted or frankly cared, Paradox would turn around and throw a hissy fit demanding people buy it. And then when they didn't, they would stop developing not just Crusader Kings, but Crusader Kings 3. Just cancel all of that. Creative Assembly, honestly, just a company of unforced errors, and my favorite among them, which is the biggest unforced error ever in my opinion, is how they treat their content creators. Now, do I care because I'm a content creator and I believe the world should revolve around me because I'm the most precious thing ever? Absolutely, feed my ego, like the video right now. I'm not asking, do it right now. Also subscribe. Also give me your money. Super chat will be fine, channel membership will be better. Anyway, annoying content creators is the stupidest unforced error you can do. Because remember, just ignoring them is also a policy and it wouldn't be a bad one. Miles ahead of what Creative Assembly currently does. And this is the culmination of the genius of their decision making. They are annoying specifically the few people in their community that have the easiest ability to amplify their voices, to amplify their complaining and grievances. Look, we creators talk, and it's a common story among Paradox Interactive creators, ironically enough, and no, I won't mention names, of people coming over from Total War going, whoa, I can say I don't like a game mechanic and Paradox Interactive doesn't start copyright striking my channel? Incredible, isn't it? Especially when again you realize how much of an unforced this error that specific reputation is. But don't worry, despite Creative Assembly's legacy of frankly award-winning incompetence, they have recently fixed all of their crimes. They released a cinematic trailer for Warhammer 40k Total War, and said about 50 times that Medieval 3 is in early development, but it's okay, we have, you guessed it, a cinematic trailer for that as well. We did it, Reddit, all is forgiven. But don't worry, even if you're personally burnt out by Creative Assembly, Paradox is definitely keeping tabs. And the great news for every Paradox fan out there is when Warhammer 40k and Medieval 3 starts selling, every copy sold will be a lesson to Paradox. What lesson? That Paradox needs to spend less time on QA, that Paradox needs to have less stuff in free updates, that Paradox needs to lock away more features behind DLC. Oh, and don't forget the main lesson. We need less modding support. Creative Assembly greatly decreased the scope of their modding tools, just compare Medieval 2 mods to newer Total War mods for things like Warhammer 3, which not only saves dev time on modding tools, but also makes a lot more money because people can't get free mods from the workshop and instead are basically forced to buy new DLC for more content. There's a reason that Anbana is an EU4 mod and not a Warhammer Total War mod, despite frankly, from the ground up, if we were just to look at the game side by side, Warhammer Total War makes much more sense as a baseline. Paradox modding capability is just so insane that you can do things like a literal chess engine inside of EU4 after all, while Creative Assembly is actively working to hinder modders. Yeah, even if you don't consider Creative Assembly as competition for Paradox Interactive, remember, Paradox Interactive does. And Creative Assembly is teaching them a lot of things you're probably not very happy with Paradox Interactive learning. I guess that leaves the people that want more competition with two final options. An Expedition 33 size team takes a crack at a Paradox game, or a Team Cherry-esque literally 1 to 3 people indie team takes a crack at a Paradox game. Well, let's start with some good news for this hypothetical indie team. It's not 1997, which is when Paradox Interactive made their first titles. Well, okay, if your baseline is Europa Universalis, that's technically the year 2000. All of that is to say, computers in 2026 are better than they were in the year 2000. Meaning you can do more things, have more features, and you have more technical capabilities for use in your game. Another aspect that is important to recognize is that as computers become better, they become more forgiving to mistakes. If you make a coding mistake that leads to you wasting, a megabyte of RAM, well, in the 2000s, there's a non-trivial chance you just crashed your game and maybe even the whole PC. In 2026, you won't notice a mistake leading to a megabyte of RAM loss because a single Chrome tab uses 400 times as much RAM just to display the Google logo and the search bar. The other reality is that the tools available for programming in 2026, everything from coding tutorials online to pre-made libraries and even established good practices versus bad practices and things like asset design, there's just a lot more of this stuff in 2026 than there is 25 years ago, right? Furthermore, Civilization and Creative Assembly and even Paradox Interactive all exist and prove that it can be done. Meaning that if you are seeking a loan, or trying to convince an investor, or even trying to prove to yourself that this project can be successful, well, the road has been paved for you with past successes. You're not inventing a brand new thing, you're just turning around doing, well, let's do that, but better. And if there's one thing that certainly has no shortage, is people complaining about the faults of Paradox Interactive, or even Creative Assembly and Total War or Firaxis on the internet. Your audience conceptually exists. It is rather unfortunately here, though, that the good news for you ends. I guess I must preface this section with a statement. I'm going to be saying all of this as a matter of presenting reality, and while I certainly hope it doesn't discourage people, well, the truth of the matter remains, in my opinion at least, that ignoring uncomfortable realities is an excellent way to achieve failure. So let's start with the elephant in the room. These games have a lot of stuff going on. The sheer volume of mechanics, systems, and just flavor for unique nations and countries that you have to make to compete with Paradox Interactive is absurd. especially when you consider that one of the more vocal criticisms of Europa Universalis 5 is the lack of flavor because every country feels the same. Now, this video is not a defense of EU5, although I feel like that is a video I'll have to make, and while I'm here, I do wish to clarify that EU5 certainly has had its problems. But if you're looking at EU5 and you've seen criticism that the nations all play the same, so your angle is an indie game that is EU5 but good, you need to have more flavor and unique stuff than EU5 does, and that's asking for a lot. We're talking hundreds of unique government reforms, thousands if not tens of thousands of events with multiple options, dozens of religions with unique mechanics, hundreds of different unit types depending on things like your culture, and we're just talking about national flavor to match a video game that's been criticized for not having enough of this flavor. This excludes economy systems, warfare systems, technology systems, and don't forget all of the art. And remember too, the Paradox AI is famously really bad, so you need to make an AI that can play your game, but also is fun to play against, and it must be not too brain dead, so it should still pose a challenge to someone with 10k hours in your hypothetical game, but also not crush Timmy who is pressing random buttons too badly as well. That might discourage them. But maybe EU5 is just an unfair example. It is a huge game after all. Well, EU5 is actually your best example, because EU5 has not had years of support yet. If you're trying to compete with CK3 or god forbid Hoi4, it's actually even worse for you in terms of included content that you're competing against. And this actually brings us to the next issue you need to remember. You're not just competing with the newest titles, you're appealing to players that care enough about Paradox games to go on the internet to complain, which is a niche within a niche. The problem for you is people willing to go give new indie games a go are also people more willing to reopen older Paradox titles. And here competition gets so much worse for you, because you can, on sale, pick up something like EU4 or Crusader Kings 2 with all DLC with a comparative price tag to a modern release. And if you're really shopping around, you can genuinely pick up something like Crusader Kings 2 with all DLC for $20 on a very specific good sale. And that's assuming no one's going to be selling the high seas. Spoilers, a lot of people are out here selling the high seas. Paradox could make selling the high seas harder, believe me. While other companies ship DRM, I've seen EU4 Mission Tree DLC that puts the code for the missions into the base game and just has a if DLC underscore name equals true, show the missions, otherwise show old missions. Because if you're wondering, how does playing with DLC in multiplayer work? Like if I don't have the DLC installed, how do I have access to these features when I connect to a lobby with a host that has the DLC? How does my computer have this DLC code for me to play with? The answer is you've always had the code. It's on your computer, it's installed in the base game. But it was literally just missing a enable DLC switch. Look, Paradox Interactive is basically gentlemen's agree in their audience to please support us financially if you don't mind. If you're buying Paradox DLC, you're buying an Iron Man check for non-modified checksum. Now, believe me, this is probably making some accountant in Stockholm very angry. I promise you there's been at least one meeting where they showed how doing more DRM or whatever, or maybe even not putting the DLC code into the base game will make Paradox $3 trillion gazillion dollars, as suddenly every single person selling the high seas will turn around and buy the DLC instead full price on the day that this change goes into effect. But what it also does, for example, is that for you, the hypothetical indie game developer, you're going to be compared to, fairly or not, to Crusader Kings 2 with all DLC for $20, or even EU4 but High Seas Edition, so a $5 for the base game if you just had to buy that, and you're going to need to do a lot to be able to win that comparison. However, we are now on the topic of money and funding, and it's just getting worse for you. Indie games already have a hard time ahead of them. I mean, basically any small business or enterprise does, but indie games are certainly no exception. Remember, however, that you're making a game that competes with Paradox, meaning that you have to have a better DLC policy. Which brings us to the next question: how are you going to make money? No, honestly, how? Good news, it's not a mobile game, you're allowed to charge an entry fee, but even Paradox doesn't do the standard $70 price tags for new releases, selling EU5 at $60 and Hearts of Iron 4, for example, at $50. And again, for the really price-sensitive chaps, well, Paradox games are no stranger to sales. Hoi4 has literally spent around 40% of its total uptime, yes, I've checked, on a 70% sale. Frequent substantial sales, as mentioned before, means that you're going to be compared, fairly or not, to Crusader Kings 2 with all DLC for $20. The thing is, Paradox and grand strategy games as a whole sit in a really weird limbo zone of single-player live service game, which combines the need of constant support updates and new features with the reality that you can't sell skins or even pay-to-win advantages. No, seriously, Paradox tried to sell unit packs and even tries again from time to time, but they just don't sell, which makes sense because not only is it a single-player game, who are you flexing your pretty skins to, but also a good chunk of the Paradox audience is running a potato PC, so they play their games with mods like Warhammer Universalis for EU4, which turns off the default icons and all of your pretty skins. And forget selling any in-game advantages, beyond ruining the game balance with you can just buy in-game money or whatever. Paradox gamers are used to console commands existing. You'll be laughed out of the room, and rightfully so. Now, you can avoid this being a single-player live service game by making the game complete from day one, but again, good luck with that when it comes to scope and execution. Remember, you aren't allowed bugs. Paradox games are bad because they do zero QA after all, so if you have more than 2 bugs in your game, you'll be called a money-hungry dev that doesn't even play their own game and does zero QA. Now, other alternatives do exist too. You can charge maybe a monthly subscription or sell your game as early access. Unfortunately, consumers hate subscriptions now because other companies ruin them by making everything a subscription, meaning your pretty reasonable request for, say, $5 a month to access a live updating video game gets compared to a car company charging a subscription for heated seats. Early access, meanwhile, is also ruined by a slew of companies that made terrible early access games and basically abandoned them, meaning that the term tends to be quite toxic. And remember, you are most likely a new team or even a new indie solo dev. You are very likely not to have a lot of benefit of the doubt, as it were. I don't want to say it's impossible, but I think it's important to realize why Paradox gamers are a really terrible audience to make games for. Their expectations are sky high, and what is delivered to them is insane when you take a step back. Let's say you bought Hoi4 on a 70% sale, so like $15, and nothing else from Paradox 8 years ago, from its 9.5-year lifespan. So you didn't even get it near release, you waited a year and a half to make sure it's good before you bought it. Well, those $15 bought you everything in the Hoi4 base game and literally 8 years of updates and improvements and bug fixes. For competition to succeed, you need to offer a better deal than that. And gee, I wonder why people aren't exactly lining up around the block to compete. The really ironic part of all of these discussions, of course, is that Paradox at some point will be just better off turning around and going, well, you guys hate me as a company anyway, why am I even bothering to be nice, and just stop doing free updates? Stop doing non-DRM heavy DLCs and stop doing things like people play with host DLC instead of requiring everyone in the lobby to own all DLC, like Civilization does, for example. And if you think that this means people will stop playing Paradox games, well, we can all point to Creative Assembly and go, no, they don't. That being said, I don't want this video to be fully doom and gloom, and to proclaim that Paradox Interactive is an untouchable entity that can defeat all competition. Mainly because the exact same thing has been said about non-grand strategy games around 10 to 20 years ago, before indie games arrived on the scene and basically started sweeping awards and player attention. This could also happen to Paradox Interactive, and I will say for the conventional viewer, you can end the video here. Thank you very much for watching, go like and subscribe, you get the point. What I want to do in this last section is offer my personal advice for someone who wants to compete with Paradox Interactive as an indie dev. And before I do start that section, do be aware I'm offering this advice as my personal belief on what you should do. See, I made the Paradox EU5 mistake of listening to comments, specifically of a couple saying verbatim that if I know the solution to all of these game implementation or things that I complain about in my videos, why don't I make my own game? So for the Colonization Sucks in Paradox video essay, I didn't offer any proposals and instead just listed issues I'd found, and got like 10 times as many comments saying I didn't offer any solutions, meaning that I have to repeat myself in those comments like 20 times over and write out a long pinned comment elaborating on this position. Wonderful. So in a continued effort to appease everyone on the internet, I currently have no plans to make a video game, and this is advice I'm offering in good faith, but nevertheless it remains just my opinion yet again. You absolutely don't have to listen to it, but if you want it, it is here. Are we all on the same page? Wonderful. Let's begin. Paradox Interactive did not start their company by making EU5 or Hoi4 or Crusader Kings 3. They started their company by making significantly smaller scoped games. Even the original Europa Universalis let you play one of 7 countries in Europe, and that was already a scope increase from Spherica where you had to play Sweden, only Sweden, the one playable nation. It is true that this is more acceptable when the competition was Civilization 2 and even say Civilization 3 potentially by the time we hit the 7 faction games, but I do believe the message stands here. Do not try to make EU5, pick a very specific time period, zoom in as much as possible, but still, within reason. You don't need to do the whole planet. Just capture that little slice of history and capture it correctly. Because if you can't do that, you have no hope of making a global video game work. But if you do succeed, that slice could be the start of a better sequel. Also, abstractions are your friend. Realism is good as a general target, sure, but I do think that believability is a better goal. For example, in EU5 there's a policy called Noble Sponsorship of the Arts, which basically means that nobles are encouraged to use their personal funds to sponsor artists and fund art schools and things like that. In in-game terms, it makes state art 10% cheaper as the nobility is footing some of the bill. However, if you actually dig really deep into the code and see what's going on when you pass this policy, in-game mechanics-wise, the nobility doesn't actually spend any money on this policy. Basically, the game just gives you a 10% discount on commissioning any art as the government. Is this realistic? Absolutely not, but it's also fine. It's believable, and I mean, literally no one is complaining about that. So you can do things like that. Abstractions are your friend. They not only save you effort in coding realistic systems, but they also save CPU work for people playing your game, and most crucially, if you design a system with, let's say, a desired outcome X, for a fully realistic system, you will need to do a lot of tweaks and a lot of changes to get your realistic system to arrive to X as your quote-unquote realistic outcome, and to get that emergence naturally. For example, if you create a model of an economic system, you would need to do a lot of tweaks and many changes to get it to simulate a boom and bust cycle. If, however, you abstract it away to a boom and bust the modifier cycle instead, you don't need to chase that outcome that you want, you can just declare that outcome, saving you a lot of design time. So to summarize, aim small, scope to a small section of the world, and to a time period of the world instead of going big, and aim for a believable representation of that section as your goal. My final suggestion, which is one that you can certainly break, but one I would strongly recommend doing, is to make your game on an area where Paradox hasn't. This means instead of players having to choose, for example, between Crusader Kings 3 and your game if they want to play a medieval grand strategy game and you also set it in the medieval period, if you set your game in the Cold War, they would have to choose between your Cold War grand strategy game, but they can't choose the Paradox option, saving you from a comparison that's very unlikely to do you many favors. Another idea may be to make a more fantasy approach or a post-apocalyptic approach. Anbanar is really popular because fantasy grand strategy games are a really underserviced niche. But so are post-apocalyptic grand strategy games as well, say the Fallout universe, or Mozart Crusader Kings 2 After the End, or even a light future setting, say a grand strategy game set in 2500 AD. Well, I hope that at least counts as ending the video on a good note, but that is all the time I have for you today. Thank you very much for watching. With a special thank you to Ark, Solar, Selemendel Zendika, Nick Hasnan Hatan, Star72, Yosin Rabbit, Vestra Gaming, Gramel, Flavia, Lebrule, W. Stov, Anthony35, AC Napo, Conspiracy Pizza, Yukata, Danray, Marvi, Jack, Ryan, Stuart Allen, Andrew Black, Nebula, Zentronic, Twinit, Aquabird, Yakuman, and Barak.